Stress often makes people feel isolated, as if they are the only ones carrying a heavy burden. Stories remind us of the broader human experience. They bridge the gap between people, showing us that others have walked difficult paths before, survived, and found meaning. It's the comfort of knowing I am not alone in this. When time stresses, stories heal. Welcome, my friends. I'm Alex. Have you ever felt like you're the only person left awake in the entire world, trapped and suffocated by your own thoughts? I've been there more times than I care to admit. Let's change that painful rhythm tonight. Interact with the video to stay in our late-night loop, and let me know in the comments what is keeping you awake. Let's explore the dark together. The Wardrobe of Souls. Before we start tonight's story, I want to tell you something. This story began with a question I could not stop thinking about. What if the person you lost was not as gone as you were told? What if the thing keeping you from knowing the truth was the one errand you kept putting off? Owen Marsh was a grieving man closing out his wife's accounts. He was not looking for a conspiracy. He was just picking up a dress. That is all it takes. Sometimes, that is all it ever takes. Newburyport, Massachusetts. A coastal New England mill city in deep October, where the salt air off the Merrimack carries the smell of cold water and old brick, and the downtown storefronts have stood long enough that they have stopped looking like businesses and started looking like features of the landscape, permanent as the granite beneath the sidewalks. My wife has been dead for 11 months. I tell you that first, because everything that happened afterward makes a different kind of sense if you understand that I was not a man in full possession of himself when I drove to Whitmore and Sons Fine Dry Cleaning on the morning of October the 14th. I was a man who had forgotten twice in the same week to eat dinner, a man who still slept on one side of the bed out of something that felt less like loyalty and more like a failure of imagination, a man who had, 8 days earlier, stood in his own kitchen holding a jar of her cinnamon and simply stared at it for what the clock later told him was 22 minutes. Her name was Caroline. She had died in March. Not dramatically, a cardiac event, the attending physician said, as though her heart had simply made a professional decision and she had left behind one small apartment in Newburyport, Massachusetts, one calico cat named Gordon, one unfinished novel about a lighthouse keeper's daughter, and one wedding dress in a garment bag at Whitmore and Sons, dropped off the previous November for preservation before she knew there was anything to survive. I am a librarian. My name is Owen Marsh. I am 43 years old, and I am telling you this because what happened at the dry cleaner that morning was the beginning of something I still do not fully understand, and I want you to have the shape of the man it happened to before I describe the thing itself. Newburyport in October smells of salt and old leaves and something underneath those things that has no name I have ever found in any book. A mineral cold that rises from the water and settles into the brick of the downtown buildings like a slow stain. I had walked past Whitmore and Sons 40 or 50 times in 3 years and had noticed it the way you notice any business that has been in one place long enough to become part of the architecture. Not with curiosity, but with the dull acknowledgement of continuity. The sign above the door was painted in deep burgundy. The gold lettering faded to something closer to amber. Whitmore and Sons, Est, 1941. The window displayed a single pressed evening gown on a headless form, lit from below by a lamp that gave the fabric a quality less like cleanliness and more like preservation. The difference between something maintained for use and something kept for reasons no one had bothered to explain. I had her claim ticket in my coat pocket. I had found it in her jewelry box 3 weeks earlier, tucked beneath a strand of pearls she had inherited from her grandmother and never worn. The ticket was pink carbon paper, the kind with a slightly waxy texture on one side and the name on it was Caroline Marsh, and the pickup date was December the 2nd of the previous year, and she had never come to collect it because by December the 2nd she had already been diagnosed with the thing that would stop her heart in March. The bell above the door made a sound like a single struck note, clear and brief and immediately absorbed by the interior, which smelled of solvent and steam, and beneath those industrial odors something older, a cedar and camphor smell that reminded me of my grandmother's closet, of winter coats and the specific darkness of places where things are kept rather than used. I noticed it the way you notice any pleasant thing when your body is still capable of noticing pleasant things. I breathed it in. I told myself it reminded me of something good. The shop was narrow and deep. A counter of dark wood ran the length of the left wall. Behind it, through a half-open door, I could see the back room. Industrial pressing machines, a ceiling-mounted conveyor from which garment bags hung in neat rows, sorting bins labeled in a hand so precise it seemed mechanical. The whole space had the atmosphere of a place in which an enormous amount of careful work happened very quietly and with very little need for explanation. A woman stood at the counter. She was perhaps 65, with silver hair pinned at the back of her neck and reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead. Her name tag said Vera. She looked up when I entered and offered the particular smile of a professional who has learned to make customers feel attended to without becoming personally involved. I placed Caroline's claim ticket on the counter. Vera looked at it. She looked at it for a moment longer than seemed necessary. Then she looked up at me, and a professional smile did its small recalibration. Still present, but rearranged in some way I registered without being able to name. She asked if I was picking up for Caroline Marsh. I told her I was her husband. I told her Caroline had passed in March. I told her I was closing out her remaining accounts. Vera's hand moved to the ticket. She touched it lightly, not picking it up, the way you might touch something you are not sure is real. Then she said, "Of course, one moment, please," and disappeared through the half-open door into the back. I stood at the counter and looked at the garment bags moving on their overhead track, the slow mechanical rotation of them in the back room, each one sealed in its thin plastic sheath. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound I could not immediately identify, a low, steady hum, lower than the pressing machines, more resonant, the kind of sound you feel in the chest before you hear it clearly with the ears. I assumed it was a boiler. I assumed it was the building. I told myself it was the sort of old commercial building that makes old commercial sounds, and I thought about whether I had left the back burner on when I left the apartment, and I was fairly certain I had not, but not certain enough. Vera returned carrying a long garment bag in burgundy, with the Whitmore & Sons logo in gold. She laid it on the counter with a deliberateness that made it seem heavier than it should have been. She smoothed the plastic over the shape beneath, the slight bell of a skirt, the vertical line of a bodice, and then she looked up at me and said she was very sorry for my loss. I thanked her. I signed the retrieval form. I picked up the garment bag by its padded hanger hook. It was heavier than I expected. Not dramatically, just slightly more, than made sense for fabric alone, the way a coat weighs more, when it is still holding the shape of the person who last wore it. The cold hit me when I stepped back onto the October street, the sharp salt smell of it after the warm cedar interior of the shop, and I carried the dress to my car and laid it across the back seat and drove home. It was only when I was standing in the bedroom, garment bag on the bed, reaching into my coat pocket for my keys, that I found the second ticket, pink carbon paper, the same waxy texture, a pickup date, October the 9th. 5 days ago. The name was not Caroline's. The name was Margaret Aldrin. I held it under the bedroom lamp. The ink was dark and clear. I had never heard this name. The ticket had been in my coat, and I had only one coat, and I had not worn it since the previous Tuesday. I set it on the bedside table and looked at it for what felt like a long time. Then I unzipped the garment bag. Inside was a wedding dress, white silk organza, long-sleeved, with a row of fabric-covered buttons running from the base of the neck to the small of the back. I stood and looked at it. It was beautiful. It was exactly as I remembered. I reached for the interior label, the small square of white satin where the maker's mark should have been, and found it blank. Not missing, present sewn in place, but unmarked. No maker's name, no size, no cleaning instructions. Just white satin with no history at all. Caroline's dress had a label. I had read it on our wedding night when I had helped her with the long row of buttons. I had read it because she had laughed and said, "Now you know where to send the replacement." There was no label. There was no mark. Only the dress and the blank satin square and the ticket on the bedside table with a dead woman's name. I searched for Margaret Aldrin on my phone. The results came quickly. An obituary, Essex County Gazette, dated September the 26th. Margaret Claire Aldrin, age 51, died unexpectedly following a brief illness. Survived by one brother in Portland, Maine. Private services. In lieu of flowers, donations to the New England Organ Donor Alliance. The pickup date on her ticket was October the 9th. She had died September the 26th. She had been dead for 18 days before she was supposed to collect her dress, and no one had come for it. And somehow her ticket had traveled from the shop's files into the pocket of my coat. I read the obituary again. Brief illness. Unexpectedly, I read it a third time and stopped at the last line. The New England Organ Donor Alliance. I set the phone down and looked at the dress on the bed, at the blank label where a name should have been, and felt something move through me that was not grief, though it was the same temperature as grief, and just as hard to locate precisely in the body. I did not know yet what I was feeling. I did not know yet what the dress was. I did not know yet what Whitmore and Sons was, or what the low hum beneath the boiler sound had been, or why the cedar and camphor smell had seemed so familiar and so wrong simultaneously. The way a word you have known your whole life will sometimes look entirely foreign when you stare at it too long. I only knew that the weight of the garment bag had been wrong, and that Margaret Aldrin had died before she could collect her dress, and that the charity printed in her obituary was the last thing I would have expected to find there. I put the ticket in the drawer of the bedside table, beside the jar of Caroline's cinnamon that I had brought from the kitchen and still could not bring myself to open. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at the dress that was not my wife's dress, and I listened to the apartment around me, the refrigerator, the water heater, the ordinary sounds of a life still running on its ordinary rails. And I tried to decide whether I was going to go back to the shop in the morning. I already knew that I was. There is a particular smell that follows you from a place where something is wrong. Not the smell itself, but the memory of it, the way your body catalogs things your mind has not yet named. That night, in the dark of the bedroom, I kept returning to the cedar and camphor of the shop, and beneath it, something underneath that, some seed other had been placed there to cover. I could not identify it. I would not identify it for a long time. By the time I did, I would understand why the dresses were heavier than they should have been, and why the women who left them there were always, in the end, alone. The cedar and camphor smell had followed me home. Not in my coat, not in the dress, but in the way smells from places that have unsettled you will sometimes anchor themselves in the back of the throat and refuse to leave. And when I woke on the morning of October the 15th, the first thing I was aware of, before the gray light at the window or the weight of the day gathering its familiar shape, was that smell, faint and certain, as though the bedroom itself had taken something on overnight. I lay still for a moment. Gordon was a warm pressure at my feet, which was the one uncomplicated thing in my life and had been for 11 months. I got up, I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the October street come to its quiet morning version of itself. A man walking a retriever, a woman in a yellow coat checking her mailbox, the particular early light that comes off the Merrimack in autumn, flat and pewter gray, The kind of light that makes everything look like it has already happened rather than like it is happening now. I thought about going back to the shop. I thought about the ticket in the bedside drawer and the dress on the bedroom chair where I had moved it the previous night, and the blank label where a name should have been. I thought about the New England Organ Donor Alliance, and then I stopped thinking about it deliberately, the way you redirect a hand from a hot surface, and I drank my coffee and told myself I would approach it methodically. I had been a librarian for 16 years. Methodical was the only mode I trusted. I searched for Margaret Claire Aldrin before I left the apartment. The obituary I had found the previous night was the only result under her full name. I added search terms, Newburyport, Massachusetts, Essex County, and found a brief mention in a local property record from 4 years earlier. Margaret C. Aldrin, listed as sole resident of 14 Powderhouse Lane, a street I knew as a short block of federal-style townhouses 3 blocks from the waterfront. I found no employment history, no social media presence, no photographs. A voter registration from 2017. Nothing after that. She had lived in this city for at least 4 years, had registered to vote once, and had otherwise left almost no trace in any record I could locate. That absence had its own texture. I recognized it the way I recognize the absence of a book that should be on a shelf and is not an empty space, but a wrong one. The specific wrongness of a gap where something ought to be present. I put on my coat. The ticket was still in the bedside drawer. I left it there. Whitmore and Sons opened at 8 in the morning. I arrived at 8:17, which I had calculated would be late enough that the shop would be settled into its working rhythm, but early enough that the foot traffic of mid-morning had not yet begun. I wanted to speak to Vera without an audience. The bell above the door made its single clear note. The cedar and camphor smell met me immediately, and this time I paid attention to it, tried to hold it still in my mind and examine its components the way you examine a sentence that does not quite parse. Cedar, yes. Camphor, yes. And beneath those, something I had registered the previous day and set aside. A cold, faintly mineral undertone, not unpleasant in itself, but present in a way that seemed inconsistent with the warmth of the shop. It was the smell of something kept at a controlled temperature. The smell of a refrigerated space bleeding through into a heated one. The shop was otherwise identical to the previous morning. The pressed evening gown in the window, the dark wood counter, the conveyor moving its slow rotation of garment bags in the back room, each sealed in its thin sheath of plastic. I noticed, today, that the bags were not uniform. Most were the standard dry cleaning plastic, clear and featureless, but several of the bags toward the rear of the conveyor were different. Burgundy, thicker, the same material as the bag Vera had brought out for Caroline's dress. Longer than standard. The shape inside each one was identifiable as a garment only in the most general sense. The way a covered object becomes abstracted from itself when you remove the visual information of its surface. Vera was at the counter. She looked up when I entered, and the professional smile arrived, and then, as it had the previous day, rearranged itself slightly when she recognized me. I told her I had found an error in my retrieval. I placed Margaret Aldrin's ticket on the counter between us. Vera looked at it. Her right hand, which had been resting open on the counter, closed slowly, the fingers curling inward and then releasing, a movement so small and so controlled that I would not have noticed it if I had not been watching closely. She asked where I had found it. In my coat pocket, I said. After I left yesterday. She nodded. The nod had a quality of something practiced, not false exactly, but prepared, as though the nod had been kept ready for this specific occasion. She said these things happened occasionally. Tickets fell, were misplaced. She would take care of it. I asked about Margaret Aldrin. The practice quality became more visible. Vera picked up the ticket and held it in both hands, looking at the name and the way she held it. carefully at a slight distance, as though it were something that had arrived from outside the controlled conditions of the shop, told me more than her face did. Her face was doing the work of a professional, maintaining composure. Her hands were doing something else. She said she was not able to discuss other customers. I said I understood that. I said I had simply noticed the name in a local obituary, and that the pickup date on the ticket was after the date of death, and that I had thought perhaps the family ought to be notified that the item was here. Vera set the ticket down on the counter. She smoothed it once with her palm, the same gesture I had seen her use on Caroline's garment bag. A gesture of settling, of pressing a thing flat into its place. Then she said the shop had a process for unclaimed items. She said families were notified. She said everything was handled through the proper channels. I asked what the proper channels were. She looked at me then, not with a professional smile, not with the careful blankness she had been maintaining, but with something that took me a moment to identify because it was so much quieter than I would have expected. It was not fear. It was the expression of a person who has been asked a question they have answered before, in a room very much like this one, by a person very much like me, and who knows with a certainty arrived at through long experience exactly how that conversation ends. She said the shop had been in this family for 83 years. She said they took their responsibilities to their customers very seriously. She said she hoped I had found the dress in good order. I said the dress was fine. I said the label was missing. Vera's hands were still on the counter. Still, not braced. The distinction mattered, and I noticed it. She was not bracing herself against something coming. She was holding herself in place against something already present, something already in the room with us, something that had been in the room the moment I walked through the door. She said labels were sometimes removed during the preservation process. She said it was standard practice for certain treatments. She said if there was a concern about the dress, she would be happy to have it re-examined. I said that was all right. I said I was sure it was fine. I thanked her and turned toward the door. I had my hand on it, the cold brass of the handle, the glass cold from the October street beyond, when she spoke again. Her voice was the same measured, professional register it had been throughout, but something in the cadence had changed, a slight slowing, each word placed with more deliberate spacing than normal conversation requires. She said she hoped I was settling in well, in the city, after everything. I turned back. She was looking at me with an expression I could not fully read, something that sat between professional warmth and a more complicated form of attention. The look of someone who knows considerably more about you than the surface of the conversation would suggest. I said I was managing. She nodded. She said Newburyport was a good place to rebuild. She said a lot of people came here to start again. She said the city had a way of taking people in. I left. I walked back toward the waterfront without deciding to. The October wind came off the Merrimack with enough force to make my eyes water, and I stood at the railing above the water and looked out at the gray river and thought about what Vera had said, and specifically about what she had not said, and about the way her hands had moved when I placed Margaret Aldrin's ticket on the counter. The shop had been in the family for 83 years. 1941. I thought about 83 years of garment bags on a conveyor. 83 years of women bringing their dresses in for preservation and sometimes not coming back to collect them. I thought about the burgundy bags toward the rear of the conveyor. Longer than standard, thicker, their contents abstracted into shapes that told you nothing. And I thought about the cold mineral smell underneath the cedar, the smell of refrigeration bleeding through. I pulled out my phone and searched for the New England Organ Donor Alliance. The organization's website was clean and institutional, a pale blue header, photographs of smiling medical professionals, the language of charitable mission statements deployed with precision. Founded in 1987. Headquartered in Boston. Partnerships with hospitals and transplant centers across New England. a donor registry with 140,000 participants. Nothing unusual, nothing that caught. I scrolled through the board of directors, the annual reports, the press releases, all of it exactly as a legitimate organization ought to appear. I almost closed the browser. I almost told myself I was reading shadows onto a wall because I was a grieving man who had not been sleeping and who had found a dead woman's claim ticket in his coat, which was the kind of thing that happened to anyone and meant nothing. Then I saw the address of their Northeastern Regional Office, 44 State Street, Newburyport, Massachusetts, 3 blocks from Whitmore and Sons. I stood at the railing above the Merrimack and let the wind come, and Gordon would be waiting at home. And I had a desk shift at the library at noon. And these were the facts of my ordinary life, proceeding on their ordinary schedule. And I held on to them the way you hold on to something fixed when you feel the ground beginning to move beneath you. I went to work. I shelved books and answered reference questions and ate a sandwich at my desk and did not think about the shop or the ticket or the address on the website, because the thinking was there whether I directed it or not, patient, circling, returning always to the same point, the way the river returns always to the sea, regardless of how many times it is redirected. That night I opened the bedside drawer and looked at the ticket for a long time before I put it back and turned off the light. The cedar smell was in the room again. I was almost certain it had not been there before I went to the shop that morning. The cedar smell was still present when I woke on the morning of October the 16th. Fainter now, retreated to the threshold of perception, the kind of thing you question rather than know. The way you question a sound that stops the moment you turn your head toward it. Gordon had moved off the bed sometime in the night and was sitting in the doorway to the hallway, watching me with the particular attentiveness that cats direct at things that have not yet moved but will. I lay still for a moment and listened to the apartment. The refrigerator, the water heater, a gull, somewhere outside, calling in the flat pewter light of a New England morning that had not decided yet whether it intended to rain. I had made a decision in the night, not a dramatic one. I was not a dramatic man, and the 11 months since Caroline had gone had filed off most of the edges of whatever impulsiveness I had once possessed. What remained was something quieter and more stubborn than impulsiveness. It was the specific refusal of a librarian to leave a question unanswered, simply because the answer was inconvenient. I was going to walk to 44 State Street. I went to the library first. I had a morning shift that I did not cancel, because canceling it would have required an explanation, and I had no explanation that did not sound like the product of a man who had been sleeping badly for 11 months and had found a dead woman's claim ticket in his coat. I cataloged 3 new arrivals, assisted a graduate student with an interlibrary loan request, and spent 40 minutes reordering the periodicals room with the methodical, hands-buzzy attention that had gotten me through the early weeks after Caroline died. There is something to be said for work that asks nothing of the interior life. The periodicals did not require my grief or my unease. They required only that I put them in the correct order, which I did. I ate lunch at my desk. A thermos of soup I had made the previous night from what was in the refrigerator. Potato and leek, nothing remarkable. And I sat with it and allowed myself to think for the first time without deflection about what I actually knew. Margaret Aldrin had died on September the 26th. She had been a Newburyport resident. She had left a wedding dress at Whitmore and Sons for preservation. The pickup date on her ticket was October the 9th, 13 days after her death, which meant the ticket had been written before her death, a normal enough fact, and the dress had remained uncollected, also a normal enough fact. Her obituary had listed the New England Organ Donor Alliance as its designated charity. The Alliance's Northeastern Regional Office was 3 blocks from the shop, and her ticket had ended up in my coat. That last fact was the one I kept returning to. Not because it was the most alarming, it was not an isolation, but because it was the fact with no available explanation. Tickets did not migrate. They were filed behind the counter and retrieved when presented. They did not travel from a shop's internal records into a customer's coat pocket during a routine pickup. For that to happen, someone had to place it there. Someone had gone to the files, located Margaret Aldrin's ticket, and put it into my coat while the dress was being retrieved and I was standing at the counter, listening to the hum beneath the pressing machines and thinking about the back burner. Someone had wanted me to find it. The question of why arrived and sat beside me at the desk like a second lunch I was not yet ready to open, and I put it aside and finished my soup and went back to work. 44 State Street was a 3-story federal brick building with a dark green door and a small brass plaque beside the bell. The plaque read New England Organ Donor Alliance, Regional Office, 2nd floor. Beside it, on a separate plaque of slightly newer brass, Whitmore Estate Management, 3rd floor. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at both plaques for a long time. The wind off the water was sharper here, away from the shelter of the downtown blocks, and it moved through the bare branches of the elm trees along the sidewalk with the particular sound that November-edged October wind makes. Not quite the sound of something alive. Not quite the sound of something not. I thought about going in. I thought about what I would say if I did. I was closing out my wife's accounts. I had found a claim ticket. I was a librarian who had run out of other explanations. I took a photograph of both plaques with my phone and walked back toward the waterfront. The library's historical archive kept physical copies of the Essex County Gazette going back to 1922. I had privileges most patrons did not, and I used them that evening after my shift ended, pulling the bound volumes for the past 3 years and working backward from the most recent. I was looking for obituaries, specifically for women. The dress on my bed had been a woman's dress, Margaret Aldrin had been a woman, and the garment bags I had seen on the rear of the conveyor had been long. The length of a wedding gown or an evening dress, not a man's suit. I was looking for a pattern. I told myself I was probably not going to find one. I found 5 in 14 months, 5 women ranging in age from 44 to 58. All residents of Newburyport or the immediate surrounding area, all deceased within the past 14 months. All obituaries listing either the New England Organ Donor Alliance or, in 2 cases, affiliated regional charities, the Northeast Transplant Foundation and the Coastal Medical Benevolence Fund, as their designated recipients, all described as having died unexpectedly, or following a brief illness, or suddenly and peacefully. The phrase appeared in 3 of the 5. I had read it in Caroline's obituary. The attending physician had used similar language. A cardiac event. Sudden. Peaceful. I sat with the bound volumes open around me in the archive room, the overhead fluorescent making its usual sound, a thin electrical hum that had always been there, and that I noticed now with a sharpness I could not account for. And I looked at the 5 names written in my notebook and felt my mouth go dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. Helen Bork, 53. October, the year before last. Patricia Doan, 47. January. Sandra Vale, 58. March. Ruth Amara, 44. July. Margaret Aldrin, 51. September. 5 women in 14 months. All local. All with the same organizational name in their obituaries. All described in language that prioritized the manner of dying, sudden, peaceful, brief, over any description of the life that had preceded it. I added a 6th name to the bottom of the list, in smaller letters with a question mark beside it. Caroline Marsh, 41, March. Cardiac event, sudden, peaceful. She had not had any known heart condition. The cardiologist had told me this afterward, in the careful language of medicine deployed to comfort. Sometimes these things simply happen. The heart is not always predictable. There is no way to anticipate. I had accepted this because accepting it was the only available option, because grief does not leave room for much else in the early months, because I had been so consumed by the fact of her absence that I had not thought clearly about the circumstances of it. I had not thought to look at the circumstances of it. She had a dress at Whitmore and Sons. She had been bringing things there for 2 years. I had found 3 prior receipts in her files when I was settling her accounts, all of them for standard cleaning, all of them collected without incident. Then she had dropped off the wedding dress in November, and she had died in March, and I had not connected those facts to anything because there was nothing to connect them to. Until now. I closed the bound volumes carefully, the way you handle materials you are responsible for and intend to return undamaged. I put my notebook in my coat pocket. I turned off the archive light and locked the room behind me and walked through the empty library to the staff exit and out into the October evening. And the cold hit me with enough force that I stopped on the sidewalk and simply stood in it for a moment, letting it do what cold does, which is to make the body very clear about what it is. I was shaking, not dramatically. A fine, persistent tremor in my hands that I noticed only when I tried to button my coat and found the buttons difficult. I stood on the sidewalk and buttoned my coat and looked at the empty street and thought about Caroline bringing her dress to Whitmore and Sons, and about the weight of the garment bag when I had picked it up, and about the blank label where her maker's mark should have been. And I thought about one more thing, which was this. I had been brought to that shop by her ticket, a ticket I had found in her jewelry box beneath the pearls, a ticket I had assumed she had left there as a reminder to herself, to be collected when she was ready. I had assumed she left it there, but she had died with the dress still uncollected, which meant she had either forgotten to go, or had been unable to go, or, and this was the thing that had begun moving through me at the temperature of grief, but was now moving at a different temperature entirely, had known she would not be going back, and had put the ticket somewhere she knew I would eventually find it. Somewhere she knew I would find it, and then find her way to the shop, and then find my way to Margaret Aldrin, and then find my way here. The wind moved through the elm branches above me. Gordon would be waiting. The library's lights were going off one by one behind me as the building settled into its locked and patient nighttime self. I stood on the sidewalk and looked at my shaking hands and tried to decide what Caroline had been trying to tell me, and whether the fact that she had been trying to tell me anything at all was more frightening than the thing she was pointing toward. Both frightened me equally. That was the honest answer. And I had promised myself at her graveside that I would try to be honest, even about the things I would rather not look at directly, especially about those. The honest answer kept me company all the way home, through the dark blocks of downtown Newburyport, where the October storefronts had begun putting their lights out one by one, past the waterfront railing where I had stood that morning, with my phone in my hand looking at an address that should have meant nothing, up the 3 flights to my apartment where Gordon met me at the door with the focused, forward-leaning attention of a creature who has been waiting a specific amount of time and is prepared to be precise about it. I fed him. I stood at the kitchen window with a glass of water I did not drink and looked out at the street below and said her name once, quietly, in the empty apartment, Caroline. She had known something. I did not know yet what she had known, or how long she had known it, or whether knowing it had been connected to what had happened to her in March. But the ticket in the jewelry box was deliberate. I was certain of that now, with the particular certainty that arrives not through reasoning, but through the body. A settling, a weight finding its center. The knowledge that a thing is true before you have assembled the argument for why it is true. I slept badly. A few hours in the early morning, the thin and unsatisfying sleep of a mind that has not finished its work and keeps returning to it, the way you return to a calculation that will not come out right. I dreamed about a conveyor belt moving in a slow loop, garment bags hanging at even intervals, each one burgundy, each one sealed. In the dream, I knew that one of them was Caroline's. I walked the length of the conveyor trying to find it, and the bags moved past me steadily, and I looked at each one as it came, and each one told me nothing. I woke before 6. Outside, the Merrimack was invisible in fog. I had her files in a cardboard box in the closet, the paperwork from her accounts, her medical records, the correspondence from the months after her diagnosis that I had sorted and filed and not looked at again since spring. I brought the box to the kitchen table and went through it with the careful attention I had been withholding from it for 11 months. The attention I had been unable to give it, because giving it meant sitting with her in a way I had not been ready to sit with her. I was ready now, or rather, I was no longer able to afford not to be. Her medical records first. The diagnosis, November the 17th, 2 weeks after she brought the dress to Whitmore & Sons. I held that coincidence in my mind and turned it slowly. 2 weeks. She had brought the dress in, and 2 weeks later she had been diagnosed with the cardiomyopathy, the weakening of the heart muscle, that had killed her 4 months after that. The diagnosis had come first, and the dress had come after. She had dropped it off for preservation 11 days before the diagnosis, not after, before. I set the medical file down and picked up the folder of miscellaneous correspondence, letters, notes, few printed emails she had kept for reasons I had never asked about. Most of it was ordinary. A letter from her publisher about the unfinished novel, notes from a writing group she had attended for 2 years, receipts she had printed and never filed properly. I went through it page by page with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that the thing you are looking for is usually not the thing you expect to find. It was the third to last item in the folder. A single sheet of paper, folded twice, no envelope. Her handwriting on the outside, just my name, Owen. I do not know how long I sat with it before I opened it. Long enough that the fog outside the window had begun to thin, the gray lights strengthening to something closer to white. Long enough that Gordon had come to sit beside the box on the table and was watching me with the amber steadiness that I had come to understand as his version of patience. Her handwriting was very clear. It had always been clear. She wrote the way she thought, directly and without ornament. She had written, "I do not know what I have gotten myself into, and I am afraid that I have left it too long to find a way out cleanly. If you are reading this, then either I have told you where to find it, or you have found it on your own, and I suspect the second is more likely because I am not sure I will be brave enough to give it to you directly. The dress is not our dress, I am sorry. The label has been removed, but the seam allowances are wrong. 3/4 of an inch, where Monique cuts 5/8. Every time, without exception, I checked this. I checked it twice. It is a different dress made to look like the same dress, and I do not know what happened to ours. I found out about the shop from Patricia Doan. She told me about the back room in December, and then in January she was dead, and I did not know what to do with what she had told me or whether it had anything to do with why she died. I have been trying to find out since then. I have been trying to find out without letting them know that I know, which I understand is probably not something I have managed successfully. If they have done to me what I think they may be doing, then my heart is not going to hold. The cardiologist says the cardiomyopathy is progressing faster than it should. I do not think this is coincidence. I think I was selected, and I did not understand what being selected meant until it was too late to be unselected. The shop is a front. The back room is the real operation. What they take is not the dresses. I love you. I am sorry I was not braver. Look for the room beneath the pressing floor. It will not be obvious. It will not be labeled, but it will be cold. There was no date on the letter. I did not know when she had written it. I sat at the kitchen table in the thinning fog of an October morning with my wife's handwriting in front of me. and felt the ground shift in a way that was not metaphorical, a physical sensation of displacement, of the floor beneath the chair becoming unreliable, of the ordinary kitchen assembling itself around me in its ordinary way, while something underneath the ordinary had changed its angle irrevocably. The dress is not our dress. What they take is not the dresses. I thought about the weight of the garment bag. I thought about the 5 women in the archive, Helen, Patricia, Sandra, Ruth, Margaret, and about the language of their obituaries, sudden, peaceful, brief, and about the New England Organ Donor Alliance, 3 blocks away, with its clean institutional website and its 140,000 registered donors. I thought about organ trafficking, which I knew about the way most people know about it. Abstractly, the province of other countries, other systems. Something that happened in places where oversight was insufficient or corruption was institutional. Not here. Not in a federal brick building on State Street with a brass plaque and a second-floor regional office, but I was a librarian. I knew how to research, and I knew that the underground organ market in the United States was documented, prosecuted, and recurrent, that it operated precisely in the spaces where legitimate infrastructure created cover, where trusted institutions provided access, where isolated individuals with no close family could be selected because their absence would produce no immediate investigation. I knew that a functioning heart could be maintained outside the body for no more than 6 hours under standard conditions. I knew that the distance between Newburyport and Boston was 56 miles. I knew that the cold mineral smell beneath the cedar in Whitmore and Sons was the smell of a refrigerated space, and that preservation of a transplantable organ required precise temperature control, and that a dry cleaning establishment with industrial equipment and a sealed back room was exactly the kind of location that would draw no particular attention from anyone who was not specifically looking for it. I stood up from the table. My legs were steadier than I expected. I thought about Patricia Doan, who had told Caroline about the back room in December and who had been dead by January. I thought about what it meant that Caroline had written this letter and left it in a folder with a dozen ordinary documents in a cardboard box in my closet, and whether she had calculated that I would not find it until I had reason to look carefully, and whether she had been right about that calculation, and how much it had cost her to be right about it. I thought about Vera, and about the professional smile and the practiced nod, and the line she had delivered as I left. The city has a way of taking people in, and I understood now that the sentence had not been warmth and had not been a threat, but had been something more precise than either, a description. A statement of observed fact delivered by a woman who had been watching the city take people in for a very long time, and who had made whatever peace she was able to make with what that meant. The fog outside the window was gone. The October sun had arrived in the flat, factual way of autumn sun, illuminating everything without warming anything. I needed to go back to the shop. I understood that. I needed to go back, and I needed to get into the back room, and I needed to find the room beneath the pressing floor, which would not be labeled and would be cold. But first I needed to understand one more thing, because it was the thing I could not unknow once I had let myself know it, the thing that had been waiting at the edge of the morning since I first read her letter and that I had been approaching sideways. The way you approach a window you are afraid to look out of. If they had selected Caroline, if the cardiomyopathy had not been natural, if the dress had been returned as a substitute while the original was kept for some purpose I could not yet name with certainty, then she had been on their conveyor. She had been one of the burgundy bags in the slow rotation of the back room.
She had been in that building, or something of her had been in that building in the months between November and March while I had been living my ordinary life 3 blocks away.
And I had walked in and picked up the bag and carried it to my car. and it had been heavier than it should have been. I sat back down. Gordon put one paw on my arm with the light, deliberate pressure he used when he had decided that I had been sitting alone long enough and that his presence was required. I put my hand on his back and felt his breathing, steady and warm and entirely indifferent to everything except the fact of contact. I stayed like that for a while. It helped, in the way that simple warmth always helps, not by solving anything, but by reminding the body that it is still a body, still here, still capable of being steadied by something small and alive and present. What I did not let myself think about, not yet, was the question of what they had taken from her, what they had placed in the bag in her dress's stead, and what it had weighed, and whether the weight I had felt in that garment bag was the weight of something that had once been Caroline carried by me, out of that shop and into my car and home and laid across my bed without my knowing. That thought was in the room. It would wait. Some things have to wait until you are ready to look at them directly, and I was not ready yet. I was not sure I would ever be ready. But I was going back to the shop in the morning, and whatever was underneath the pressing floor was going to tell me what I needed to know. The thing about grief that no one tells you, or perhaps everyone tells you, and you simply cannot hear it until you are inside it, is that it does not diminish so much as it reorganizes. In the early months, it is everywhere at once, undifferentiated, filling every room and every silence and every moment of inattention equally. Then, slowly, without your permission or awareness, it begins to gather itself into specific places, a smell, a particular quality of light at a certain hour, the sound of a name spoken in a register you associate with someone who is no longer available to respond to it. It becomes architectural. You learn to navigate around it. You develop the habitual avoidances of a person living in a house with one room they do not enter. I had not entered the room of how she died. I understood that now, sitting in my kitchen in the October morning with her letter on the table between my hands. I had grieved her absence with a thoroughness that had left me hollowed and remade, and I had not once, in 11 months, grieved the mechanism of her leaving. I had accepted the cardiologist's language, cardiac event, not predictable, no known prior condition, and I had filed it in the same mental category as weather, as geology, as the category of things that simply occur without cause or author. Things that happen to people. I had not asked who it happened to her for. Caroline had been 41 years old. She had been a person of extraordinary physical precision. She had run a half-marathon the previous September, had eaten with the disciplined attention of someone who understood the body as a system to be maintained rather than indulged, had gone to her physician twice yearly with the same methodical commitment she brought to everything she considered worth doing. She had no family history of cardiac disease, no indicators, nothing the medicine had been able to point to afterward except the fact itself, which is not an explanation but is often made to stand in for one. I had let it stand in for one. The letter was dated, I now saw, looking more carefully at the upper right corner, where her handwriting was smaller than the body of the text. February the 19th, 3 weeks before she died. She had known for 3 weeks. She had written it in February and put it in the folder and had not given it to me directly. She had written, "I am not sure I will be brave enough," and she had been right. And she had died in March before the question of bravery could present itself again. I thought about what those 3 weeks must have been. Living in this apartment with me, eating the meals I cooked, sleeping in the bed we had shared for 7 years, watching me go to work and come home and notice nothing. She had been trying to find out more. She had said so. I have been trying to find out since then. And so those 3 weeks spent in the company of what she knew and what she suspected and what she was not sure how to give to me without also giving me the fear. The specific fear of a person who has understood that they have been selected and has not been able to find the way out of being selected. I understood now, for the first time, what it must have looked like from inside that. She had gone to Whitmore and Sons for 2 years for ordinary cleaning, standard service. She had brought items in and collected them without incident, and somewhere in those 2 years something had changed. Some threshold had been crossed, some criterion satisfied, and she had shifted from customer to candidate. And she had not known it until Patricia Doan told her, and by then it was December, and whatever process the shop had initiated was already underway. The cardiomyopathy diagnosed in November, the weakening of the heart muscle, progressing faster than it should. The cardiologist's own words returned to me now with a meaning the cardiologist had not intended and would not have understood. They had needed her heart. The full shape of it arrived not as a shock, but as a recognition, the way the meaning of a sentence arrives sometimes several words after you have read it, the understanding catching up to the information. They had needed a heart, and they had found her. And the dress had been the mechanism, the dress brought in for preservation while something else was already in process. The dress kept in the back room while she was managed toward the outcome they required, and then the dress returned as a substitute, heavier, after she was gone, delivered to her surviving husband who would take it home and hang it in a closet and ask no questions because he was a grieving man who had no reason to ask questions, except she had given him a reason, had placed it in the jewelry box beneath the pearls. Had trusted that when he finally went through her things, methodical, thorough, the librarian's refusal to leave an account unsettled, he would find the ticket, and the ticket would bring him to the shop, and the shop would bring him to the names, and the names would bring him here. She had built a trail for me through her own death. The precision of it was so entirely her that I had to press both hands flat on the table and breathe for a moment because the grief had suddenly reorganized again, had gathered itself out of the dispersed general ache it had been living as, and concentrated into a point so specific and so sharp that it had a location in the body, in the chest, just left of center, which was also where the heart is. She had known she was going to die. She had known who was killing her and how, and she had not been able to stop it, and she had spent the weeks she had left building me a road through the dark so that someone would know, so that I would know. I sat with that for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and searched for Patricia Doan. The obituary I had found in the archive was brief. 47, January, sudden, peaceful, the Northeast Transplant Foundation, but I had not searched further at the time, had been cataloging names rather than investigating individuals. I searched now with more specific terms. Patricia Doan Newburyport employment history. Patricia Doan State Street. Patricia Doan Whitmore. The third search returned a result I had not expected. A cached page from the website of a local business association, dated 18 months ago. A brief profile of member businesses in the State Street corridor. Whitmore and Sons Fine Dry Cleaning, established 1941, currently operated by the third generation of the Whitmore family. And a note about a recent renovation to the building's lower level, completed in partnership with the Coastal Medical Benevolence Fund to upgrade storage and environmental control systems. The Coastal Medical Benevolence Fund, one of the 2 affiliated charities I had found in the obituaries. The renovation had been completed 14 months ago. Helen Bork had died 13 months ago. The sequence had the logic of preparation, the infrastructure built, and then the work begun. Below the business profile, in a comment section that the site had apparently not maintained, a single entry posted 11 months ago from an account with no profile photograph and a name that read only PD. The comment said, "Does anyone know who owns the building at 44 State?" Asking for a reason. The comment had no replies. The account had no other activity. PD Patricia Doan, dead 2 months after she posted it. She had been looking for the same thing Caroline had been looking for, and Caroline had learned from her, and both of them had run out of time. I thought about what it meant that two women had been working toward the same answer from different directions and had been stopped before they arrived, and whether the stopping was always this clean, this medical, this attributable to natural causes, or whether Patricia and Caroline were among the ones who had been managed carefully because they had gotten close enough to matter. I thought about whether I was being managed now. The thought arrived with a physical response, a sudden awareness of the apartment around me, of its windows and its one entrance and its 3 flights of stairs that would take a specific amount of time to descend. The body accounting for exits, the body doing the arithmetic of exposure without having been asked. I had called no one. I had told no one what I had found. I was a man who lived alone, who had no close family in the area, whose patterns were visible and predictable. The library, the waterfront, the apartment, the slow circuit of a solitary life organized around routine. A man who fit the profile. That phrase surfaced from the source story's architecture, selected because he fit the profile, because he lived alone, because his patterns were predictable. And I recognized it with the particular cold clarity of a person understanding something about themselves they cannot take back once understood. I had come to this city after Caroline died because she had lived here, and I had not been able to go back to our previous life without her in it. I had been here for 11 months. I had been going to the waterfront and the library and the apartment and back again. A man of visible and documented solitude, a man whose absence would require a certain amount of time before anyone thought to ask where he had gone. I stood up, my legs held. I went to the bedroom and stood in front of the dress, still draped over the chair where I had moved it 2 nights ago. White silk organza, long-sleeved, 37 fabric-covered buttons from nape to small of back. I took the jacket from its hook and examined the seam allowances the way Caroline had told me to examine them. 3/4 of an inch, not 5/8. The dress was not ours. The dress had never been ours. Whatever was inside the burgundy bag I had brought home from Whitmore and Sons, it was not a dress. It was heavier than a dress. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table beside her letter. Then I sat down in the chair across from both of them and looked at the things my wife had left me, her words, and this object, and the road she had built through her own dying for me to follow. And I made the decision I had been moving toward since the morning I found the ticket in the jewelry box, which was this. I was going to finish what she had started, whatever that required. I did not open the bag that night. I was not ready, and I knew I was not ready. And I had learned in 11 months of grief that the things you approach before you are ready have a way of breaking something in you that more time would have protected. The morning would come. The shop would be there. Vera would be at her counter with her practiced nod and her hands that closed and released under pressure. And underneath the pressing floor, in the room that would not be labeled, the cold would be waiting, patient, sustained, the cold of a space designed to preserve what it contained for as long as it was needed. The morning came the way October mornings in Newburyport always come, without ceremony, the light arriving flat and pewter off the river, the cold having deepened another degree in the night, the city settling into its working self with the unhurried competence of a place that has been doing this for a very long time and does not require any particular person to witness it. I fed Gordon. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee and looked at the street bliss below, at the ordinary Tuesday of it, at the woman in the yellow coat at her mailbox, and the retriever walker and the delivery truck angling into the narrow one-way with the particular optimism of a driver who has done this before and knows something the geometry does not immediately suggest. I looked at all of it and understood that I was memorizing it. The way you memorize things you are not sure you will have access to on the other side of what comes next. I had not opened the garment bag. It sat on the kitchen table where I had placed it the night before, beside Caroline's letter, and I had made my coffee and my toast, and moved around it with the careful attention you give to something that is occupying the center of a space and cannot be moved until you are ready to deal with what it contains. I was not ready. I was going to the shop first, and whatever I found there would tell me whether I was ready. I left the apartment at 8:40. I walked the 3 blocks to State Street in the particular cold of a Newburyport morning in late October. The kind of cold that comes in off the water and moves through a coat rather than being stopped by it, that finds the back of the neck and the edges of the wrists and settles in with the patient intention of staying. I had her letter folded in my inside pocket. I had my notebook. I had made no plan beyond arriving, because the plans you make before you understand a situation are rarely the plans you end up needing. Whitmore and Sons was not yet open. The burgundy sign was unlit, the window display unchanged, the pressed evening gown on its headless form, the lamp giving the fabric its preserved quality, the same gown that had been there every time I had passed, and that I now looked at with a different understanding of what it meant for a garment to be held in a state between use and keeping. I waited on the sidewalk. The cold was company enough. At 8:58, a key turned in the lock from the inside, and the door opened, and Vera stood in the frame in her silver hair and her reading glasses, and looked at me with an expression I had not seen from her before. Not the professional smile, not the practiced nod, not the careful blankness she had been maintaining across our previous conversations. What was on her face was simpler and older than any of those things. It was the expression of a person who has been expecting a knock on a door they have been dreading for a long time, and who feels alongside the dread something that is almost relief. She stepped back from the door without speaking, which was its own kind of speech, and I followed her inside. The cedar and camphor smell was immediate and strong this morning, stronger than it had been on either of my previous visits, and beneath it the cold mineral undertone was more present, less bleed, more source, as though the refrigerated space below was closer to the surface of the building than I had understood. Vera walked past the counter without stopping and through the half-open door into the back room, and I followed her past the pressing machines and the sorting bins and the conveyor with its slow rotation of garment bags, past the burgundy bags at the rear that I did not look at directly, to a door at the back of the room that I had not previously seen because it was set into the wall at the same depth as the surrounding paneling, painted the same color, with no handle visible until Vera pressed a specific point in the wood, and the door swung inward on a weighted hinge. Beyond it was a staircase, concrete, industrial, descending at a steep angle into a space that was lit from below with a cold white light, the kind of light that has no warmth in it, the light of a space designed for function rather than occupation. The cold rose from it in a steady exhalation, the kind of cold you feel change the temperature of the air around your face when you open a refrigerator door. Except this was not a refrigerator door, and the space below was not refrigerator-sized. Vera went down the stairs without hesitating, and I followed, and the door above us swung closed on its weighted hinge, with a sound that was very quiet and very final. The room beneath the pressing floor was long and low-ceilinged, perhaps 15 feet wide and 40 deep, with concrete walls that were wet with condensation at the seams, and a floor of sealed industrial tile that had been cleaned with a thoroughness that told you about the things it regularly needed to be cleaned of. The white light came from fixtures recessed into the ceiling at even intervals. Along both long walls ran refrigerated cases, the kind used in medical and laboratory settings, glass-fronted, stainless-framed, temperature-controlled to a precision. The display panels on each unit reported in green numerals. Each case was approximately 6 feet long and 2 feet deep. Each case was sealed. Each case held a garment bag, burgundy. The same bags I had seen on the conveyor upstairs. I counted them without meaning to, the way the mind counts things when it is trying to give itself something to do. 22 cases, 22 bags. Vera stood in the center of the room with her hands at her sides and looked at me and did not offer any of the formulations she had been using upstairs. Her voice, when she spoke, had the quality I had identified from Section 13's first register, clinical flat, the voice of someone who has processed a horror intellectually and drained it of emotion because the alternative is not functional. She had been living with this for a long time. I could see how long it had been in the way she stood in this room, the absence of any adjustment in her posture or her breathing that would indicate the room was affecting her. She had stood here many times. She had made whatever accommodation a person makes when they are required to stand in a room like this many times. She said she had been waiting for someone to come. I asked how long. She said she had been working this counter for 31 years. She said the room had been here for 14 months. She said her father had run the shop before her, and his father before him, and the shop had been only a shop for most of that history. And then 14 months ago, a man had come and made an arrangement that her father had once made a different version of, during a different time, for reasons she had been told were legitimate, and had chosen to believe, because of the alternative was not something she had known how to hold. I asked what the arrangement was. She said the cases maintained a constant temperature of 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees above freezing, the standard for short-term organ preservation before allocation and transplant. She said the bags on the conveyor upstairs were for transit, garments in for standard service, and among them, at intervals, the burgundy bags, which were transported downstairs after hours and placed in the cases until collection. She said collection happened every 4 to 7 days, depending on the viability window of the contents. She said the collectors came after midnight, through the alley entrance at the rear of the building, and used a key she had never been given a copy of. I asked who the collectors were. She said she had never been told. She said she had asked once, at the beginning, and the man who had made the arrangement had looked at her with an expression she had not been able to interpret clearly, and had said the less she knew about the allocation process, the better position she was to continue doing what she was doing. She had understood this to mean that her usefulness depended on her containment. She had understood that what she was doing could not be undone, and that the arrangement did not have an exit, and that her 31 years at the counter were not the context in which she was going to find a way out of it. I asked who made the selection, who identified the women. She was quiet for a moment, a long moment. The room held its cold around us, the refrigerated cases humming at their precise temperatures, the green numerals reporting steadily on the state of what they contained. She said it began with the donor registry. The New England Organ Donor Alliance maintained a registry of 140,000 participants. The regional office on State Street had access to the full database: medical profiles, blood types, tissue compatibility records, contact information, next of kin designations. Within that database, she said, there existed a subset: women, specific age range, specific tissue profiles, specific cardiac indicators. Not pathology, not illness, but markers that indicated a heart of particular value, strong musculature, clean vascular history, compatible typing for a waiting recipient whose need was urgent and whose resources were substantial. Women who were, she said, and here her voice dropped a further register, still flat, still clinical, but with a quality beneath it that I recognized as the sound of a person reciting something they have had to recite to themselves many times in order to continue. Women who were identified as living alone, with limited immediate family, with patterns that made them, as she said, accessible. The word sat in the cold room and meant what it meant. She said Caroline had been on the registry since 2019. She said, Caroline's profile had flagged 18 months before her death. An exceptional match for a recipient in Boston, high net worth, private arrangement, not through the official allocation system. She said the approach had been made through the shop, which had been Caroline's point of regular contact, and which provided a mechanism for the preservation process to begin while the recipient's team prepared. She said the cardiomyopathy was induced. She said this with the same flat precision with which she had said everything else, each word placed with deliberate care, and I stood in the cold room and let it arrive. She said she was sorry. I believed her. That was the thing I had not expected, that I would believe her, and that believing her would not make it simpler, but would make it more complete. The horror sealed rather than open-ended, the shape of it fully present now in the cold white light of the room beneath the pressing floor. I asked what she wanted me to do. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and brought out a key, small, silver, with no identifying marks. She held it out to me. She said the third case from the left on the north wall. She said I should look at the tag on the bag inside. She said I would understand what I was being given and what I was being asked to carry forward with it. She said she could not do what needed to be done from inside the shop, but I was not inside the shop. I was the one person who had come from outside the system and found his way to the room, and that was not an accident, and she had been waiting for it, and she was done waiting. I took the key. The case opened with a sound like an intake of breath, the seal releasing, the cold spilling outward over my hands in a wave that was not painful but was absolute, the cold of a space that had been holding its temperature against the world for a long time and was now, briefly, open. The tag on the bag inside the case was written in the same neat block print as the claim tickets. A name, a date, a service code I now understood the meaning of. I read it once, and then I read it again, and then I closed the case and stood in the room for a moment with the key in my hand and the cold on my face, and the green numerals resuming their steady report. And I knew what I had been given, and I knew what I had to do with it. The tag read, Marsh C. November 14th, Pres, plus, the service code for preservation, premium, extended indefinite hold. She had been in the third case from the left for 11 months. I stood in the room with the key still in my hand, and the case closed again before me, the green numerals resuming their steady report of 34 degrees, and I was aware of my own breathing in a way I had not been aware of it since the hospital in March. The specific consciousness of the mechanical fact of breathing, the body's reminder that it is still doing the work it was built to do, that it will continue doing that work regardless of what the mind is experiencing. I breathed in, I breathed out. The cold of the room settled against my face and my hands and the back of my neck, and the refrigerated cases hummed their even hum along both walls, and Vera stood behind me at the bottom of the stairs with her hands at her sides, and I did not turn around for a long time. I had understood before I opened the case what I was going to find. I had understood since part 4, since the weight of the garment bag, since the seam allowance of the substitute dress, since the sentence in Caroline's letter that I had approached sideways for 3 days and had finally looked at directly. What they take is not the dresses. I had assembled the understanding piece by piece with the methodical patience of a librarian building an argument, and the argument had been complete for some time before I had acknowledged it as complete. But there is a distance between understanding a thing intellectually and standing in the room where the thing itself is, 3 feet away in a sealed case at 34 degrees, preserved in the viability window of a system that had been using her for 11 months and had not yet found cause to release her. She had been here when I came to collect her dress. I had stood at the counter above this room and signed the retrieval form and carried the garment bag to my car. And she had been here beneath me, 12 feet down through concrete industrial tile, in the third case from the left. I turned around. Vera had not moved from the base of the stairs. She was watching me with the careful attention of someone who knows they are witnessing a moment that cannot be hurried and should not be interrupted. And I looked at her and tried to find something to say, and found nothing that was adequate to the room. I asked instead the question that had been waiting beneath all the other questions since the morning I read the letter. I asked how she was still viable. Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she said the cases were not standard preservation. She said the system had been developed specifically for extended holds, months, not hours. The viability window expanded through a process she did not have the technical language for, but that had been explained to her in terms of suspended state, of metabolic deceleration, of something that was not quite life and not quite its absence, but that maintained the tissue in a condition of readiness for an allocation that had not yet been finalized. She said the Boston recipient had experienced complications that delayed the procedure. She said the hold had gone on longer than any previous case. She said she did not know the outer limit of the extended preservation, and that, not knowing it was the thing she had found hardest to live with. I turned back to the case. Through the glass front I could see the burgundy bag, its tag pressed flat against the interior surface, the neat block print of her name facing outward. Marsh C. I put my hand against the glass and felt the cold of it transfer through my palm, through my fingers, the specific cold of a surface that has been maintaining a single temperature for 11 months, without variation or failure, steady and inhuman, and entirely indifferent to what it was preserving. I had promised her I would finish what she started. What she had started was this: the trail, the ticket, the names in the archive, the letter in the folder, the road she built through her own dying that led here, to this room, to this case, to the tag with her name on it, and the service code that meant extended hold, and the green numerals that reported 34 degrees and had been reporting 34 degrees since November the 14th, while I lived 3 blocks away in the apartment we had shared and fed, Gordon and Shell. Books ate my meals and did not know she was here. The decision my body made was not one my mind participated in. My hand found the lock on the case, and the key was already in it, and the seal released with the same intake of breath sound it had made before, the cold coming outward over my hands in the same absolute wave, and I reached inside and took hold of the bag by its padded hook and lifted it out, and the weight of it was the weight I had felt in the garment bag I had carried home from the counter above. That specific wrongness of something heavier than fabric, heavier than the ordinary objects of ordinary life. The weight that had registered and been set aside, and that I now recognized with my whole body rather than just my hands. I carried it to the center of the room. Vera made a sound, not a word, not quite, and I looked at her, and she looked at the bag and then at me, and her face had broken through the clinical flat register into something underneath it, something she had been maintaining the clinical flat against for a long time, and I understood that what I was doing was not what she had given me the key to do. She had given me the key to look, to confirm, to take what I knew out into the world above, and use it as evidence, as testimony, as the thing that would bring the right people to this room and stop what was happening here. She had not given me the key to open the bag. I understood this, and I also understood that I was not going to put the bag back in the case and walk up the stairs and use what I knew as evidence, because evidence requires a faith in systems and institutions that I had lost at some point in the past 7 days that I could not precisely locate. The system that had killed Caroline was staffed by people who wore institutional credentials and operated through legitimate channels, and had the infrastructure of organized medicine deployed as cover. I had no confidence that the systems designed to address that kind of harm were not already adjacent to it, not already compromised at some level I could not see. not already occupied by people who had the same relationship to the official version that Vera had to the shop above. Complicit, contained, unable to find the exit. What I had confidence in was this: she had built me a road. She had expected me to follow it to the end. I set the bag down on the cold tile floor. I cannot describe what came next in clinical terms. I am not going to try. I will tell you what I know, which is that I sat down on the floor of the room beneath the pressing floor of Whitmore and Sons Fine Dry Cleaning, and I put my hands on the outside of the sealed bag, and I spoke to her. I spoke quietly, the way you speak to someone in a place where quiet is required, not because anyone could hear me, but because loud would have been wrong, would have been a violence of register, would have been a voice that did not belong in the room. I told her I had found the letter. I told her I had followed the road. I told her I was sorry it had taken 11 months, and that I understood why it had taken 11 months, and that I did not blame her for the 11 months, only for the fact of leaving it all, which was not something I had ever said to her directly, and which I had needed to say for a long time. I told her about Gordon, who was still eating and who had taken to sleeping in the exact center of the bed, which was a decision she would have considered aggressive and which I had decided to interpret as healthy self-expression. I told her the novel was still in the drawer where she had left it, and I had not read it, not yet, not because I was afraid of it, but because I was not sure I was ready to hear her in that particular way, and I was trying to learn the difference between the things I needed time for and the things I was simply avoiding. I told her I was going to get her out of this room. Vera had sat down on the bottom stair at some point, I was not sure when. She was watching me with her hands folded in her lap and her reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, and an expression that had nothing professional left in it. Nothing practiced, nothing maintained. It was the expression of a woman who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had sat down to watch someone else decide what to do with it. I stood up. My knees protested. The tile floor was cold through my trousers, the cold having worked its way through fabric and into the joints with the patient thoroughness of something that does not hurry because it does not need to. I lifted the bag. I held it against my chest, both arms under it, the way you carry something you are determined not to drop. I asked Vera if the alley entrance was alarmed. She said not to her knowledge. She said the collectors had a key, and she had never been told there was a secondary system. I asked her what she was going to do when I left. She looked at me for a long moment. The reading glasses on her forehead caught the cold white light of the room and reflected it in a thin, bright line across the lenses. She said she was going to go back upstairs and open the shop, and she was going to work her shift, and when the shift ended, she was going to drive to her sister's house in Gloucester, and she was not going to come back. She said she was sorry. She said it again, and this time I heard in it all the iterations of sorry that a person accumulates over 31 years of being inside something they did not know how to leave. The small daily sorry, the ritual sorry, the sorry that has become structural rather than felt, and then, at the end, when the weight of it is finally put down, the sorry that feels true again. I told her I believed her. I meant it the same way I had meant it before, which was completely. I carried the bag up the stairs. Vera followed. At the top, she went left through the back room toward the counter, and I went right through a door I had not used before, a utility door that opened into a narrow corridor that smelled of solvent and old pipe, and through that corridor to the alley entrance at the rear, a heavy door with a push bar and no visible alarm panel, and I pushed it open and stepped out into the October light of a Newburyport morning that was doing what October mornings do, which is to proceed with total indifference to the events of human lives conducted in its presence. The alley smelled of brine and cold stone and the ordinary refuse of a working street. I stood in it for a moment, holding what I was holding, and breathed the air and let the light be what it was. The walk back to the apartment took 9 minutes. I did not take the direct route. I walked along the waterfront because she had loved the waterfront, because the sound of water had been something she returned to when the interior became too full, and I thought she deserved to hear it one more time. Whatever hearing meant in the condition she was in, whatever the quality of experience was inside the extended preservation that I did not have the technical language for and that existed somewhere between life and its absence. I walked slowly. The cold came off the river, and the light was flat and pewter and entirely itself, and I carried her home. The bag was on the kitchen table when Vera knocked. I had not expected her to come. I had expected, if anything, the alternative. The shop opened and operated and closed as though nothing had changed, Vera driving to Gloucester in the evening as she had said she would. The room beneath the pressing floor discovered empty by the collectors when they arrived after midnight through the alley entrance, the absence noted and whatever response the absence triggered proceeding, in whatever way it would proceed. I had expected to be alone with what I had brought home, at least for a time. The knock came at 11:17, and I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment listening to it, and then I went to the door and opened it, and Vera was in the hallway with her coat on and her reading glasses in her hand and a canvas bag over her shoulder, and an expression that was not the same expression she had worn in the room beneath the pressing floor, and was not any of the expressions she had shown me across the counter of the shop. It was the expression of a person who has made a decision they know they cannot take back, and who has arrived at the place the decision requires them to be. She said she had closed the shop. She said she had put the closed sign in the window and locked the door and walked here. She said she needed to give me something before she went to Gloucester, and that she had been carrying it for a long time and could not take it with her. I let her in. She sat at the kitchen table. Gordon came and examined her shoes with the forensic attention he directed at new presences, and she looked down at him and something crossed her face. Not a smile, but the space where a smile would have been in a different version of this morning. The faint impression of the expression without the expression itself. She reached into the canvas bag and brought out a folder, the kind with the elastic band around it, thick with documents. She set it on the table, beside the garment bag, and looked at both of them for a moment without speaking. Then she said the folder contained the records she had kept. 31 years of records. Not the official ledger, not the business files, but a secondary account she had maintained in private, in handwriting, in a series of notebooks she had transferred to paper and organized into this folder after she understood, 14 months ago, what the shop had become in its third iteration under her family's name. She said the records documented every name, every date, every service code. She said there were 47 names over 14 months, of which 22 were currently in the cases downstairs and the remainder had already been collected and allocated. She said each entry included the source notation, the donor registry flag, the recipient profile number, the arrangement contact, and that the arrangement contact was the same individual in every case. A man she knew only as the person who had come 14 months ago with the proposition and the infrastructure and the argument that what he was offering was a solution to a problem the legitimate transplant system had created by being too slow and too principled and too attached to equity for the people who needed solutions most urgently. She said she had known when he made the argument that she was being given a choice between two kinds of complicity, and that neither of them was clean. She had chosen the one that kept the shop open and her father's name on the door and the 31 years of her working life intact, and she had been making the payments on that choice every day since, the small daily sorry, and now she was done. I asked about Caroline specifically. I needed the record to be complete. Vera opened the folder. She found the entry without searching. She had organized it to be found, had put it near the front, had understood that this was the entry I would need most, and had made it accessible with the care of a person who knows they owe someone a specific debt and intends to pay it in full. She laid the page on the table and I looked at it. Caroline Marsh, November 14th, Press, plus extended recipient notation. Boston, private, urgent, arrangement contact, same. A medical notation in the margin, in a different hand, that I needed a moment to parse. The handwriting was compressed and technical, the vocabulary of a profession I did not belong to. When I understood it, I sat with it for a while before I said anything. The notation described the induction method, a compound administered through a standard medical encounter, a routine appointment, a wellness visit, something Caroline would have had no reason to refuse or question. The compound initiated a progressive cardiomyopathy indistinguishable from the idiopathic presentation in standard diagnostic workup. Onset 4 to 6 weeks after administration. Progression managed through secondary contact to ensure the timeline aligned with recipient readiness. Caroline had been diagnosed in November. She had died in March. The timeline was managed. I looked at the date on the notation. October the 3rd of the previous year, 6 weeks before her diagnosis. She had dropped the dress off November the 14th. She had been diagnosed November the 17th. She had not known, when she brought the dress in, what had already been put in motion. She had found out afterward, through Patricia Doan, and by then the cardiomyopathy was already progressing and the question of finding a way out had collided with the reality that the way in had closed behind her. The thing I had not been able to say in the room beneath the pressing floor, the thing that had been too large and too precise to say in that cold white space, arrived now in the kitchen, in the ordinary morning light, and I said it, not loudly, just in the register of a fact being acknowledged. She did not know. When she brought the dress in, she did not know. Vera said no. She said that was correct. She said the selection happened before the contact always. The person was identified and flagged, and the process begun before any approach was made. The dress was a mechanism of the preservation phase, not the selection phase. Caroline had been selected months before the dress came in. The dress was simply where the process moved to next. I sat with this for a moment. Then I picked up the folder, the whole of it, and held it. I asked Vera what she expected me to do with it. She said she had thought about this carefully. She said she did not expect me to take it to the police, though I could, though the records were detailed enough to support a serious investigation, though the arrangement contact's notations in the margins of several entries included enough identifying information to be useful. She said she did not expect this because she understood that I had reasons to be uncertain about institutions and their relationship to the system she had described, and that uncertainty was not irrational, and she was not going to tell me it was irrational. She said what she expected was that I would know what to do with it when the time came. She said the time would come. She said a journalist. She knew a name, a woman in Boston who had been writing about the underground organ market for 3 years, and who had been looking for documentation of the domestic network that her sources had told her existed, but that she had not been able to locate evidence of. She said this journalist would know what to do with the folder and would know how to do it in a way that could not be managed or contained by the people who would want it managed and contained. She reached into the canvas bag again and brought out a card, a name and a phone number. She placed it on the table. I looked at the card. I looked at the folder. I looked at the garment bag which had been sitting at the center of the table through all of this, patient and sealed and holding what it held at whatever temperature the kitchen provided, which was not 34 degrees and which meant the window was narrowing, had been narrowing since the moment I lifted the bag from the case, was a clock I had been trying not to think about too directly. I asked Vera what happened now. for Caroline what the right thing was. She was quiet for a long time. Gordon had come to sit between us on the table, which he was not permitted to do, and which I had stopped enforcing some months ago, and which Caroline would have enforced cheerfully and without apology. Vera looked at him with that same space where a smile would be, and then she looked at me. She said she had spoken, the previous winter, to a priest she trusted. Not from her own parish, a man she had known for many years who understood that the questions she was bringing him were not hypothetical and had not asked her to pretend otherwise. She said he had told her that what a person needed, when they had been taken out of the world before the world was finished with them, was to be brought back to a place where they had been themselves. A place that held them when they were whole. Not a church, not a ceremony. A place. She said she had thought about this for months and had not known what to do with it, but she thought I might know what place that was. I knew immediately. It was the waterfront. Vera stood. She put the canvas bag over her shoulder. She looked at the garment bag one last time, and then at me, and she said something that I did not expect, which was this. She said she was glad I had come. She said she had been waiting for someone who would come the way I came. Not with authority, not with a warrant, not with the weight of an institution behind them, but as a person who had loved someone and followed the road they left. She said it was the only approach that would have worked. She said she thought Caroline had known that she left. I listened to her footsteps on the 3 flights down, and the outer door, and then the street, and then silence. I sat at the table for a while. The kitchen was warm. The light through the window was the flat October light I had been living inside for 11 months, and it was doing what it always did, which was to make everything look like it had already happened. And for once I found that quality not melancholy, but accurate. It had already happened, all of it, and I was still here, in the kitchen, in the light, with the card and the folder and the bag. And Gordon was on the table, and the coffee was cold in the mug, and the refrigerator was making its usual sound, and the ordinary machinery of the apartment was running on its ordinary rails, and underneath all of it was the specific permanent knowledge of what I now carried, and what I was going to do with it. I picked up the card with the journalist's name. I put it in my coat pocket beside Caroline's letter. Then I picked up the garment bag, and I went out. The waterfront at noon in late October has a quality of suspension. The tourist season finished, the fishing boats fewer, the benches along the railing mostly empty, the river doing its patient work between the granite banks, with the same indifference to observation it had maintained for 10,000 years before the city was built on its shores, and would maintain for 10,000 years after the city was gone. I walked to the bench at the end of the pier, the one she had liked best, the one with the widest view. I set the bag beside me on the bench. I did not open it. I sat with her in the October light and the smell of the river, the brine and cold stone of it. Nothing like cedar and nothing like camphor, nothing like a room maintained at 34 degrees. Just the smell of water moving over rock in the open air, which is the oldest smell there is, and which asks nothing of the people who sit beside it. 6 weeks have passed since the morning I carried the bag out of Whitmore & Sons through the alley entrance and walked to the waterfront bench and sat with her in the October light. I am writing this now in January at the kitchen table where the folder sat and the bag sat, and where Gordon still sits in the evenings with the proprietary ease of a creature who has decided that the table is his and that I have agreed to this, which I have. The window is dark. The heat is on. Outside, the first real snow of winter is doing what New England snow does in January, which is to arrive without drama and accumulate without apology, and the street below is quiet in the specific way streets go quiet when snow falls, a muffling, a softening, the city's ordinary sounds, wrapped in something that holds them at a slight distance from themselves. I am writing this because Caroline wrote, and because she left me a record, and because the account deserves to exist in a form that is not a folder of handwritten notations and marginal medical abbreviations, but something a person can read from the beginning and understand from the beginning, in plain language, without needing to have lived inside it to know what it means. I called the journalist on October the 21st. Her name is Rachel Ozzie. She had been at a Boston paper for 11 years and had been working the underground organ market beat for 3 of them. And when I told her I had a name and a folder and 47 documented cases with arrangement contact notations, she was quiet for a moment that I recognized as the quiet of a person recalibrating what they thought they knew about the scope of the thing they had been investigating. She came to Newburyport the following day. She sat at this table and went through the folder for 4 hours without speaking, except to ask specific, precise questions about provenance and chain of custody and the circumstances under which I had obtained what I had obtained. She was careful and thorough, and exactly the kind of person Vera had described, and she left with a copy of every document and a recording of the interview, and the look of a person who has just been handed the thing they have been looking for, and is already thinking about what comes next. What came next took 6 weeks. I know this from the newspaper, which published the investigation 12 days ago, and from the subsequent reporting that has followed it, and from the calls I have received from people I do not know who found the number through channels I cannot fully account for. The arrangement contact has been identified. 2 people connected to the New England Organ Donor Alliance's regional office have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The building at 44 State Street is currently the subject of a warrant. Whitmore & Sons is closed. The burgundy sign removed from the awning. The window dark. I have walked past it twice since the investigation published. Not to look at it, but because it is on State Street, and State Street is between my apartment and the waterfront. And the waterfront is still where I go, in the mornings when the weather permits, which January does not always permit, but which I go to anyway, because she went there, and because the river is unchanged, and because some habits are worth keeping regardless of the temperature. I have not heard from Vera. I looked for her once, through the channels available to a librarian who knows how to use them, and found a property record in Gloucester, indicating that a V. Whitmore had taken a long-term lease on a small house near the water in the 3rd week of October. I found nothing else. I did not look further. There is a particular form of accounting in which the debt is genuine and the payment is genuine, and you simply accept both of those facts and do not require anything additional from the person paying, because requiring anything additional would be a different kind of cruelty than the original one, and I had enough cruelty in my accounting already. The changes in my daily life have not been dramatic. They have been the kind of changes that are easy to miss from the outside and impossible to miss from the inside. The alterations in the small structure of how a day is organized and what it contains and what it costs. I sleep differently, not better, not worse, differently. The sleep I have now does not have the quality of the sleep I had in the first 11 months, which was the sleep of a man trying to get unconscious enough that the grief would not follow him down. This sleep is lighter. I wake sometimes in the early morning and lie still and listen to the apartment, the refrigerator and the water heater and the particular creak of the building in winter when the cold contracts the old wood, and the listening is not anxious. It is something more like attention. The difference between those 2 things is difficult to describe and was difficult to discover, and discovering it was one of the changes. Gordon sleeps in the center of the bed. This is his established position, and I have fully conceded it, which means I sleep on my side of the bed, and there is a cat in the middle, and the other side is empty. And this arrangement has the virtue of honesty that the previous arrangement, the careful maintenance of one side left vacant in the specific shape of an absence, did not have. Caroline would have evicted him from the bed on the first night, and then let him back on the second night, and told me she had not, and I would have known she had and said nothing. And this was one of the 100 small domestic negotiations of a shared life that I had not understood how much I loved until it was no longer available to me. I understand it now. The understanding is one of the changes. I read the novel. I waited until November, until the investigation was underway and the folder was out of my hands and the weight of what I was carrying had distributed itself somewhat more evenly across the people now responsible for carrying it. And then one evening, I opened the drawer in the bedroom where she had left it, and I took it out. And I sat in the chair by the window, and I read it, all of it. In one sitting, which took most of the night, the snow starting outside the window sometime around 2 in the morning, and the light changing from dark to the particular gray luminance that snow gives to nighttime, and Gordon coming to sit in my lap at some point and staying. The novel is about a lighthouse keeper's daughter who grows up believing that the light is what keeps the ships safe, and who discovers, when she is old enough to understand the mechanism, that the light does not keep the ship safe. It simply shows the ships where the danger is, which is a different thing entirely, and which requires a different kind of courage from the ships than she had previously understood. It is not a horror novel. It is a quiet novel, the kind that does not announce itself and does not resolve cleanly, and that stays with you in the way that honest things stay with you, which is quietly and permanently. She was 3 chapters from the end when she stopped. I do not know why she stopped, where she stopped. I do not know if it was the illness or the fear or the simple practicality of a person who had more urgent writing to do. The letter, the trail, the road through the dark. I am choosing to believe it was the last of those, because it is the interpretation that gives the stopping a purpose rather than a limit. And I am trying, where I have a choice between interpretations that are equally unprovable, to choose the one that costs me less while still being honest. I have been thinking about finishing it, not writing it. I am a librarian, not a novelist, and the novel is hers and its incompleteness is hers, and it would be a different kind of wrong to put my sentences where her sentences would have gone. But I have been thinking about the ending, about what the lighthouse keeper's daughter learns in the final 3 chapters that Caroline did not write, about how the courage of showing where the danger is differs in practice from the courage of keeping people away from it, about whether those are actually different things or whether they are the same thing approached from different angles, which is a question the novel was already asking in the chapters that exist, and which I think she knew how not to answer tidily, because she never answered anything tidily when the untidy answer was more true. This account has a title. I found it the morning I sat down to begin writing, which was in December, the first morning since October that I woke before the alarm and lay still in the half-light and knew what the day required of me. The title is the thing Vera said, which she said as description and which turned out to be more than description. The city has a way of taking people in. That is the title. Those are the words I am writing underneath. They are the words that contain the whole of it. The shop and the cases and the 47 names. And Caroline in the 3rd case from the left, and the weight of the garment bag I had carried home without knowing, and the ticket in the jewelry box beneath the pearls and the road she built, and the bench at the end of the pier, and everything that has happened in the 6 weeks since, and the novel in the drawer, and the snow outside the window now, and Gordon in the center of the bed. I called Rachel Osei last week. She is still working the story. She said there are more facilities. She said Newburyport was one node in something larger and that she had found in the arrangement context documentation reference to operations in 4 other northeastern cities she was not yet prepared to name in print. She said the investigation was going to take more time. She said she was glad I had called her. I said I was glad I had called her too. After I hung up, I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The snow had stopped by then, and the street was the particular white of a January morning in a coastal city. The cold and the salt working against each other, the snow already beginning its slow retreat from the sidewalks inward. The woman in the yellow coat was at her mailbox. I had not seen her since October and had not realized until I saw her again that her coat was the same color as the lamp in Whitmore and Son's window, that particular amber that reads as gold at a distance, and I stood at the window and watched her collect her mail and go inside, and thought about the ways in which an ordinary street assembles itself from things you have learned to see and things you have learned to overlook, and how that assembly shifts permanently and without your permission when something changes the instruction set. The street looked the same. It was not the same. I am going to submit this account to Rachel for the public record when the investigation reaches its conclusion. I am going to put Caroline's letter in the archive at the library, because she was a writer and writers belong in archives, and her letter is the best thing she ever wrote, which is not something I will say publicly, but which I believe completely. And then I am going to read what she wrote in the months before she died, and I am going to sit with the ending she did not finish, and I am going to let the question she was asking remain a question, because that is what she would have wanted. And because some questions are not there to be answered, but to be kept, turned in the hand like a stone worn smooth by water, returned to again and again for the specific quality of the weight. I submitted the account to Rachel on a Tuesday in February, 3 weeks after I finished writing it, because I spent those 3 weeks reading it back to myself in the evenings and making the small corrections that a person makes when they want a thing to be as true as they can make it, and because I needed to be certain that what I had written was not the account of a grieving man constructing a narrative to give his grief a shape and a villain and a resolution, but the account of what actually happened in the order it happened, with nothing added that was not there and nothing removed that was. I have been a librarian for 16 years. The standard I hold documents to is the standard I held this one to, and when I was satisfied that it met that standard, I sent it. Rachel called the following morning. She said she was going to run it in the paper's Sunday edition alongside the ongoing investigation, attributed my name on it, which I had said she could do, and which I still believed was the right decision, because anonymity would have been a form of distance from that the account did not deserve. If Caroline had signed her letter, I could sign mine. The Sunday edition came out on February the 9th. I bought a copy at the newsstand on State Street, which is 3 doors down from the dark awning where the burgundy sign used to hang, and where now there is nothing. The front window covered with paper from the inside, the closed sign still in place from the day. Vera locked the door in October and walked to my apartment with her canvas bag and her 31 years. I stood on the sidewalk with the paper in my hands and looked at the covered window and thought about the headless form that had stood in it, the pressed evening gown lit from below by the amber lamp. And I thought about the first morning I had stood on this sidewalk waiting for the shop to open, not knowing what was beneath it, the cold coming off the Merrimack at my back, the key already somewhere in the sequence of events that would lead me to it, though I did not know that yet. I did not go in. There was nothing to go into. But I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, which was where the story had required me to stand from the beginning. And I let the cold be what it was, and the covered window be what it was, and the dark awning above it be what it was, which was a thing that had ended. Then I walked to the waterfront. The bench at the end of the pier was empty. It is almost always empty in February. The tourist benches along the railing go unoccupied for most of winter, the cold and the wind off the Merrimack making the waterfront a place you pass through rather than stop in, and the bench at the end of the pier most of all, exposed as it is to the full reach of the river, open on three sides to whatever the water is doing. She had liked it for exactly this reason. She had told me once that she needed places that did not let her be comfortable in the wrong way, that she did her clearest thinking in places that made comfort require some effort. I had pointed out that this was a somewhat demanding philosophy. She had agreed and sat down on the bench and looked at the river, and said that demanding philosophies were the only ones worth having. And I had sat down beside her and looked at the river too. And that was one of the mornings I carry the way. You carry things that were ordinary when they happened and become luminous only afterward. In the light of their having been the last time, it was not the last time I sat on that bench, but it was the last time I sat on it not knowing it was the last ordinary time, and there is a difference. I sat down now. The February cold was immediate and specific. A different cold from October, drier, with more intention. The kind of cold that does not settle into brick and bone, but presses against them, deliberate, reminding you clearly that you are a warm thing in a cold place, and that the distinction requires maintenance. I put my hands in my coat pockets. The river was high with winter runoff, moving faster than it moves in the slower months, the surface gray-green and opaque, and the sound of it against the pier pilings was different in February than in October, less a lapping, more a steady, sustained pressure, the sound of a large amount of water going steadily somewhere. I had brought two things. The first was Caroline's letter, folded in my inside pocket as it had been since October, as it had been every day I had gone out of the apartment since the morning I found it on the kitchen table beside the garment bag. I had been carrying it the way you carry a thing that is not finished with you yet, and I had understood when I woke that morning that it was finished now, that I had done what she had built the road to ask me to do, and that carrying the letter any further was no longer honoring her but holding on to her past the point she had intended, and that she had never been a person who asked to be held past the point of her intentions. She had been precise about what she needed and precise about when she was done needing it, and I had loved that precision even when it was difficult, and I intended to honor it now. I took the letter out and unfolded it and read it one last time. I love you. I am sorry I was not braver. I read it twice. Then I folded it along its creases, the same two folds she had made, her fold lines, not mine, and I held it for a moment in both hands. The river was doing its patient work below the pier. The cold was doing its honest work against my face and hands. I sat with both of those things, and with the letter, and with February, and let the sitting be enough. Then I placed the letter in the inside pocket of my coat and kept it there. I had thought, in the days before this morning, that the right completion was to release it, to let the river take it, or to burn it, or some other physical act of deliberate conclusion. But, sitting on the bench in the February cold with the river moving below me and the letter in my hands, I understood that I had the sequence wrong. The letter was not a thing to be released. It was not ballast to be cut away, or remains to be interred. It was correspondence. It was something she had written to me, and that I was keeping, the way you keep letters from people you love, not as relics, but as evidence of the ongoing fact of having been known by them. The archive at the library would receive a copy, because she was a writer, and the letter was her best work, and it deserved the care of a permanent record. But the original was mine. I was keeping it. That was the completion. Not the release, but the keeping. The deliberate decision to hold it, not out of inability to let go, but out of the knowledge that some things are not meant to be let go of. They are meant to be carried, consciously, with full knowledge of their weight, as a chosen thing rather than an imposed one. The second thing I had brought was smaller. A stone from the riverbank below the pier, collected on one of the October mornings when I had been standing at the railing trying to think clearly, smooth and dark gray, worn by water into an oval so nearly perfect it seemed intentional. The kind of stone you pick up without knowing why and put in your pocket and carry home and set on a windowsill. The kind that accumulates a place in a life through the sheer persistence of being there. I had found it in my coat pocket in November, and understood then why I had picked it up, and had put it on the kitchen windowsill where it had been since. I took it out now and held it in my palm. It was cold from the coat pocket, cold with the specific cold of a thing that has been kept at the temperature of an October morning for 4 months, the cold of a kept thing. I looked at it for a moment. Then I placed it on the bench beside me, on the spot where the garment bag had sat in October, and I left it there. Not as a ceremony, not as a ritual, simply as a thing placed in a place where something important had happened, in acknowledgement that the important thing had happened, and that the bench and the river and the cold February morning were all still here, and were all still themselves regardless. I stood up. The cold pressed against my face with its honest February intention. The river moved below me with its 10,000-year indifference to the events of human lives conducted in its presence. The stone sat on the bench, dark gray and oval, already taking on the cold of the open air. I walked back along the pier toward the railing, and then along the railing towards State Street. Past the benches and the mooring posts and the places where the fishing boats tied up in the warmer months. The city was beginning its Tuesday morning version of itself around me. The delivery trucks, the coffee shop doors opening, the particular sound of Newburyport at 8 in the morning in winter, purposeful and undramatic. The sound of a place that has been doing this for a very long time. I turned onto State Street. The covered window of the former shop was on my left. I did not look at it. I walked past it the way you walk past a place that has been emptied of its meaning. Not avoiding, not acknowledging, simply passing. The way you pass a scar that has finished hurting. I walked 3 blocks to my building. I climbed the 3 flights. I unlocked the door. Gordon was on the kitchen table in the position of settled authority he maintained whenever I had been out long enough to register as absent. He looked at me. I looked at him. I took off my coat and hung it on its hook, the letter in the inside pocket, and went to make coffee. The smell of the river had come in on my coat. Brine and cold stone, the open-air smell of moving water. It was in the kitchen now, faint, present, carried from the waterfront on the fabric of an ordinary coat, by a man walking home from a bench in February. It was nothing like cedar. It was nothing like camphor. It was just the river, in the kitchen, in the morning, which was where she would have liked it.